Welcome to the Vol Performance Online Workshop Series. Really fortunate to have Tannath Scott with us today to talk about fatigue in team sports, considerations for measurements and decision making. Tannath's currently working as a Postdoctoral Research Fellow at the University of New England and has previously worked at the Brisbane Broncos in the NRL. He's completed his PhD looking at high intensity training in team sports and really looking forward to the discussion today. Thanks for joining us, Tannath.
Pleasure being here. Thanks, mate.
Just going to make you host and you can, I'll stop sharing my screen and feel free to share yours.
Right, let's do that. Can you see that?
Perfect.
Perfect. Right, well, yeah, thanks again, mate. So it's good to be part of this. I really firstly appreciate, I guess, the content that you guys have been putting out in this COVID period. It's been really good. It's been good to be able to digest a lot of what some other great practitioners around the world are thinking and the programs that they're implementing and the transparency around what's going on. So hopefully I can do the same. Today, I guess what I've tried to do is encapsulate how we go from defining fatigue all the way through the process to delivering an actionable strategy in and around that, and probably try to highlight the complexities of that. So I'll first start off looking at how we conceptualize fatigue, then specifically move into team sports and try to look at the terminology in and around that. Focus on some considerations we need to look at when we're measuring these constructs, how that then integrates into developing some frameworks around decision making and submaximal fitness tests, and probably deliver, I guess, something actionable at the end of it. So conceptualizing fatigue. Unfortunately, fatigue is a decidedly complex system and quite poorly defined. Across different disciplines, you're going to find that it has pronounced different classifications, and this is due to being, I guess, a non-specific symptom. So in sports performance, what we typically would look at defining fatigue, and there's plenty of different definitions, which is part of the problem, which I'll get to in a second, but something in and around the acute impairment of a task related to either the perception of work required to apply to get it done or the incapacity to produce that force. Typically in team sports, and I guess more broadly, we look at fatigue in two different functions, and that being peripheral and central. And peripheral, I guess, are the physiological processes that influence contractile function, and central are those that institute the degree of muscle activation. However, defining it isn't probably that easy, and it creates a lot of ambiguity. So Anoka and Deschateau fairly recently put together a high performance aim of how we can potentially go about identifying and measuring fatigue. And what they looked at here, I think the big takeaways were describing it in terms of fatigability, and that is to normalize it to the level of fatigue experienced by the athlete. And we know that needs to be relative to the task, and task dependency and fatigue go hand in hand and been shown time again. And then separating it into performance and perceived components. And this is where it takes a bit different tack to what has previously been looked at. And that being, previously, I guess we would label it, be it neuromuscular fatigue, be it metabolic fatigue. But what Anoka and Deschateau, I guess, propose is that we call this fatigability either perceived or performance fatigability. In that performance fatigability, you'll notice that those are very much peripherally and centrally driven. So if we look at things like contractile function, we might be talking about force capacity, excitation, contraction, coupling, calcium kinetics, things like that. Muscle, we're talking motor recruitment and activation patterns. We look at the perceived fatigability and homeostasis being, changes in blood glucose levels, hydration, core temperature, and how that affects the perception of the athlete. But then also the psychological state being arousal, motivation, pain, a whole numerous myriad of factors that can go into that as well. So ultimately the interaction between those comes out with fatigability. And I quite like the way that this is framed, because it does make it relative and try to make it context specific. But in team sports, that isn't often the case. And I guess that research and that proposal, albeit it's a great almost signs and symptoms framework, but it hasn't probably stood up and hasn't been incorporated. So there's potentially a reason for that. More recently, Thorpe and colleagues put together a review looking at, I guess, fatigue in team sports and how we measure and monitor that. And they described it as the inability to complete a task that was once achievable within a recent time frame. I think that's a nice shift in the paradigm where we're starting to incorporate time and this time course into it, because that is, at the end of the day, what we're talking about in team sports. And we've got a very cyclical nature of team sports in that you're usually performing one game a week. I know COVID's throwing that out the window, but most team sports abide by those rules. Obviously, you've got basketball, baseball, hockey, ice hockey that might play numerous times a week, but you do have squad rotation and different bits and pieces. But that time course and the cyclical nature, I think, fits in rather nicely with what we do with team sports. At the end of the day, you're trying to identify something or a construct that may inhibit performance or cause depression in performance, and that being the performance of match play and the hierarchical outcome of match play, or put the athlete at an amplified risk of injury. And so along the way, and we're trying to identify those risks and those inhibitions and balance them out to obviously create a framework of decision making. As I said, just despite Anoka and Deschâteau's framework that they put forward, typically in this space, whether it be in the applied setting and in research, we sort of break fatigue down to the pathways that are assessed, be that neuromuscular, metabolic, autonomic nervous system, perceptual. And I don't foresee that changing. I think coaches like to delve in within these, I guess, pathways, albeit they might create some ambiguity, but we have to understand that that's a limitation. So when I talk about fatigue and I start to introduce this idea of time courses, I think it's something that we need to be more finite on. And ultimately, how we define those time courses comes back to the interaction between what fatigue we're looking at, how that profiles, but then what decisions we're making on the back of it. So if we take a top-down approach looking at decision making, I think this is the sort of framework that I like to use. And it is based on that. So we've got the immediate fatigue, which is just simply the fatigue witnessed during a performance task and the depression of that task at the time. Acute fatigue, which is a reduction in the force capacity, 0 to 24 hours. Then probably we get down to the area of more substance. So there's subacute or residual fatigue, which is in that 36 hours, G+2+3, which is when typically we start bringing guys and girls back into training. And then persistent fatigue. So when we look at this subacute residual fatigue, essentially what we're looking at is a performance downturn in the presence of reduced availability of muscle glycogen, ATP-PC, metabolic byproduct, or the increased perceived fatigability of those athletes and or the higher effort required to produce a similar outcome. When we start moving into that persistent fatigue, which is, that classified that 72 hours post, we're basically looking at a performance downturn when we have the return of many of these physiological processes returning to homeostasis. So we should be recovered, but we aren't. And I've tried to show here how that profiles based on the literature. So this is in rugby league and rugby union. It's a recent systematic review by Rick Aben and his team for his PhD over in the UK. And they've brought together all this research from both league and union or rugby codes. And I've tried to overlay those time courses that I previously talked about and talked through how they might profile within a team. So this is looking at neuromuscular function, counter movement, jump, peak power, so peak power change. Now we know that this might fluctuate differently and very much dependent on the stimulus that is elicited, but we get generally a decrement in the 24 hours post. Following that, in the next 32 hours, that starts to return upwards to baseline. And then hopefully after that 72-hour process, then we're starting to get back to what was previously achieved. Again, if we look at the creatine kinase, so CK levels and then the changes there, we've got this immediate increase. And again, it's probably not in rugby, it's not necessarily the degree of damage, but showing that there is damage there in the first 24 hours. And then across the next 3 days, 3 to 4 days, we do see a reduction in this to what is persistent. Perceptual responses, we see the same thing, a big spike in the first 24 hours or at 24 hours, and then we see a slow decline through that residual phase. So what I sort of want to highlight here is that these finite periods potentially, and you can classify them differently, you can roll those windows, but this is what I've used historically, and I think it fits quite nicely in team sports. When we start to examine training loads, we commonly recognise that there's an increase, with an increase of training stimulus, we have an increase in fatigue that's induced, and that's training theory. I think that's pretty finite, but the paradox here that has been established in the literature is how does this fatigue relate to injury, and how does this dose relate to injury? And what we typically have seen through numerous research is that not training much is probably not great, and doing too much work isn't great. And if we look at the work of Tim Gavin, and again, some of these methods have obviously been questioned, but I think the broader concept remains true. And that is, Tim showed that athletes who have high training loads may have fewer injuries than those at lower workloads. But then again, in different parts of the literature, we find that higher training loads, once they exceed a certain amount, we're going to be at risk of more injury. There's also potentially some change in movement that goes on there as well, and some coordination that might place you at greater injury risk as well, in the efficiency of how we move. But it makes it quite difficult to try to find where these thresholds are, and are there finite thresholds, and provided and amplifying them on a group is very different to pushing those onto an individual athlete. And so we might sweat over increasing training load, and are we actually increasing the risk of injury, or are we reducing the risk of injury? When we look at, I guess, meta-analysis and more broadly speaking, there isn't a great deal of research that supports the idea of a greater injury risk under greater amounts of fatigue, and I'll probably get to the nuts and bolts of why that may be the case. But this is a bit of an excerpt from a recent paper from Matthew Bourne, looking at ACL injury in sport and seeing no real relationship between player workload and training or competition. And a similar meta-analysis by Tim Doyle has shown the same thing, where looking at a pseudo measure of fatigue being either the accumulation of load across a season and the depth of the season, or across a game. But they showed that there isn't really any evidence to suggest that fatigue increases the likelihood of injury, either the further you get into a game or the further you get into the season. So if we're not seeing these relationships, but we think there's a theoretical framework for this, what is going on? And are we measuring it properly? And is that potentially the issue, or are we just measuring the wrong things? And it's probably a mixture of both, and a greater understanding here, and in what is a poorly defined area of human physiology, really. So if we take a look at injury risk, the methods that we currently quantify injury risk are rather difficult to implement. And that is primarily due to the numbers of injuries that you have to get to have a conclusive outcome from these. But not only is that the case, but Colin Fuller brought to light in this excerpt you can see here is that it's not only the systematic quantification of injury risk, but it's the systems that are built off the back of that and decisions that are built off the back of that that are potentially causing further inconsistencies and discretions when we're looking at this injury risk paradigm. Further to that, often, as I sort of alluded to just a minute ago, is that we have a pretty poor understanding on how it affects the individual athlete, the N equals 1, which is in the practice what we're dealing with day in, day out. So trying to understand a bit more about how that individual athlete is sitting in relation to their own paradigm, their own continuum, is of high importance. One of the biggest conclusions that Jones and colleagues I found from this systematic review was that they highlighted that there's a massive disparity in the literature regarding the use of how we term these key phrases. What is training load? What is fatigue? What is injury? And that has created a shift in terms of that with the vague understanding of what these are or how we define them, it really sets us up for failure with trying to identify how to improve them or where these relationships lie. So there's really no consensus on what fatigue is across and within disciplines. And as a result, where research has gone is that we've tried to highlight or assess fatigue using a whole range of measurements, be that force power profiling and outputs, EMG, RPE, mental acuity. So that's one side of the shift. The other side is that the fatiguing protocols that have been elicited to try to understand fatigue have varied substantially as well, whether it be simulated match plays, running, isolated single leg, single joint, isokinetic exercises. So we've got a lot of grey in here, which really makes it hard to interpret the findings. It probably leads to a lot of these findings being inconclusive around the relationship between fatigue and injury. And part of those definitions I provided earlier, we need to get to a space where we can better define these concepts. And Anoka talked about this in the early 90s, about this boom in what would be fatigue research and the fact that from his optimism in the early 90s to where we got to, it didn't really eventuate. And I think a lot of that has to do with the idea of these definitions. And so there probably is a relationship between fatigue and injury risk, but we're sort of yet to nail that down. When we look at fatigue and performance, Bannister, I didn't say Roger Bannister then, put down his concepts on the modelling between fatigue and fitness and performance output. And that's widely used and widely grasped. But within team sports, we do have multiple doses, be that concurrently within the day or looking at systematic match play to match play. So it's not as simple as just this singular construct. And it's far more complex when we're dealing with multiple athletes who are having multiple doses across days and within days. And that'll ultimately, we're trying to peak them to performance. And that performance might be a singular game, it might be multiple games, it might be trying to steadily build up to important games at the back end of the year. And this is ultimately a double-edged sword because within training, we're trying to induce fatigue. It's what supports adaptation. You know, supercompensation theory would have that. With that rest, we can create some adaptation that will create more resilience against that fatigue further on. So it is a necessity, but it's certainly shown that when we're trying to prescribe this work or prescribe a given dose within individuals, when you do that within a team and you're looking across a spectrum of 40 athletes, it's very hard to be very specific around that dose. And we've seen that, within the gym that can have a variance of up to 400% between athletes. So despite what we do as practitioners and our best laid plans, our initial intensity of a training session can soon become inaccurate within that session. and then fatigue can accumulate and we can start to move away from what the aims of the session may have been. We can use things like auto-regulatory systems such as velocity-based training to try to help keep us on the road as we go. And we've seen different types of feedback can have positive and negative effects on how athletes train and the fatigue off the back of that. Within match play, it's fairly obvious that across a given dose of work that we are going to reduce the effectiveness of the ability to produce a given load. So we do see changes in work rate occur, and it's a reason for some of our substituting that we use, particularly in unlimited substitutions sports. But in match play, we're overcome with a couple of other contextual factors that make it even more difficult. And this creates an ambiguity around fatigue, and it makes it very difficult to control within the game. And so on the back of all this, both performance and injury, we need to be very well defined and have a sensitive measure that we can essentially look at fatigue, and those constructs are going to vary. So we definitely need to highlight different areas. The way I envisage this is that I guess there's been a lot of push recently, and Jay Delaney and some of his colleagues have done a great job in around this, about highlighting that we can have tools that can silently monitor athletes. And I think this is more prevalent when we've got higher control or there's lower chaos and there's less volume or stimulus that those athletes are adhering to. In this case, we can be proactive about our strategies, we can stick to periodized planning, and we can potentially use some of these silent monitoring tools, looking at the relationships between internal and external load, among others, within that space. But it's when we have a high chaos, high load scenario where we need to be more reactive. And that's typically, if you look at gameplay, like I just alluded to, where we have, we may not know how the athletes responded to that situation until we actually get them in the building. This can be done through a myriad of ways, training load monitoring, looking at dose response relationship. Most organizations will do this to some capacity, looking at self-reported measures, again, stressing that these need to be validated. Neuromuscular function, counter-movement jump, isometric mid-flight pull, biomechanical hormonal markers. Again, this can be done. I think there's a lot more variability within that, so we need to be cautious when we're trying to implement some of those. And looking at autonomic nervous system, an example of that, which I'll show you later with submaximal testing. So the three primary questions I have on which trying to unpack this is, first and foremost, does our fatigue measure represent an actual performance suppression and or injury risk in our sport? So does our measure of fatigue that we're trying to capture, our construct, does it actually have any bearing on what that athlete is trying to do during a game or the potential risk of them getting injured? And that can be difficult to answer at that time that you're implementing that. But I think it's the question that we need to keep our eyes on, because we can have changes in a lot of different variables across weeks, within sessions, between sessions. But if those changes don't actually affect what that athlete goes out and does and performs, then what we're collecting is fairly useless. So I think we need to make sure that we've got a bigger picture on what we're actually trying to do and how we're trying to support these athletes. Does that measure that we're trying to identify actually relate to the force limit capacities of performance? So this is probably a step deeper to that. Can we actually be sensitive around what we're trying to identify? And lastly, can we identify a plan based on this information that can positively affect performance and or decrease the risk of injury moving forward? And so in order to do that, there's a few considerations that we need to take into account when we're choosing measurement tools. I've stolen this from Dave Howarth, who's a colleague, and we've gone back and forth, particularly in this COVID period, around how we measure fatigue, and we both have differing and similar opinions on it. It's been great. So I actually, for those of you listening to this, Vald have there's a YouTube link to Dave's presentation from a Dallas conference that he did, which is super useful. And so if you want to dig a bit deeper into some of these constructs, then I urge you to watch that. But essentially, we need to make sure our performance measure is relative to performance. It stands some base and it has some foundation for what we're trying to achieve, how we're trying to program, and what the athlete's trying to do. So when we're talking about neuromuscular function and sumo wrestling, well, a couple of those areas that are on screen there are going to be absolutely useless for us identifying neuromuscular fatigue that may be sensitive to the performance changing of those athletes. And this is where I start to introduce the idea of it not only being valid, which is sort of what we're talking about there with that phasic movement, but also that it's sensitive, and that's potentially more important to us than it being reliable. And when we talk about sensitivity, we're typically talking about signal to noise ratio, and there's probably different ways to approach this. And Sam Ryan recently did a measurement properties paper, which highlights this well, but it talks about the interplay between reliability and sensitivity, and essentially that reliability should be used and can be used in conjunction with the weekly variation to produce a signal to noise ratio. And when we do reliability studies, we typically do a test retest, which might occur within a day, 2 days, 3 days, sort of at max maybe 7 days of each other. That's typically done at the start of the preseason, and it might not represent the noise that we're going to occur when we're trying to differentiate some of this signal in season or at different phases of preseason. So it's important then that we start to, I guess, unpack a little bit of how we're going to distinguish what is important versus what isn't important. In the research, a coefficient of variation of 5% or less is seen as being great. And that's important to a degree, but it's completely arbitrary. And I'd argue that we need to start moving away from this idea that it's just under 5% is really good, under 10% is probably acceptable, and then we start moving away from that, because some measurements and some outcomes are going to have greater variation naturally between them, but doesn't render them useless. So this again is taken from some of Dave Howlett's work that he's done at Tannath Rugby. And Dave is doing a deep dive into this, and it's been great to sort of chew his ear off about this. But these values here, and from memory, this is using the average of 3 counter movement jumps across a test, retest. So 3 different days and then 3 different jumps within those protocols. And as you can see, the coefficient of variation is quite low. So we would deem these as being reliable and therefore useful. When we start to look at some of these rates of force development and power and rates and velocities at certain times, we might find that there's more natural variation. But that doesn't mean that we should move away from these, because these potentially are identifying more of a strategy around jumping if we're talking counter movement jump here. So this is from an athlete at Tannath Rugby. And what you can see here is even when we look at the greater variation and take into account, we still get huge fluctuations that can be useful for us in identifying areas that may be fatiguing for this athlete or performance benefits. So making sure we don't chuck the baby out with the bathwater when we see these different reliability outcomes. Implementing that into a week, or looking at how that noise might be associated. So this is a typical rugby league week that I've been involved in. Again, I appreciate this. This is completely different to what those of you that might be listening might have done. But looking at a week to week. So this would be a Saturday to Saturday game in this instance. And from a counter movement jump or looking at neuromuscular function, we might want to test them here. This is the first day that they come into the building. They've got skills, some sort of physical on field, and weight. So we might bring them in the morning and test them. We also might look at how they've essentially shifted along that continuum to the captain's run or the last training session. And have they returned to baseline across some of these measures? Have our interventions been successful? Are we ready to perform come game day? And when we look at the noise then, we can either look at the noise from a Tuesday to Tuesday. What's the natural variation of these athletes when they come off a game? Because if we're just looking at utilising the reliability of a pre-season test retest that might be really tight, well, we might be getting some natural variation that isn't necessarily really actionable and might not really be relative to anything that we might deem important. We can look at the noise and set the noise looking at the parameters from Tuesday to Friday. So what's the natural profile of these athletes as they go from the first training day through to the last training day? And again, that has limitations as well. And we might need to shift that. It might be weekly dependent, but trying to understand that it's greater than just these really finite protocols that we might want to deliver on a reliability study. And again, what does a Friday to Friday look like? So starting to broaden our understanding of this sensitivity, signal, or the noise associated between and within these sessions, and then how we can look to differentiate the signal once we get past that. And that then really leads to shifting the bandwidth of our interpretation. And that bandwidth for what is actionable is going to change. And I appreciate for those working, say in the NBA, if you've got your best player and he's said that some of the variables that we've looked at that may be sensitive to injury or performance are flagging, you're not going to pull that athlete based on that, because your bandwidth for what they are able to achieve on the court and the fact that they can win your games is probably worth more than the risk associated with any performance decrement and or injury risk. So we need to take that into account as well. These decision-making frameworks can be actioned in a systematic way. And I think what we often do is we get lost in the forest from the trees, so to speak, and we sort of lose sight on what that path looks like. And essentially, in order for us to action every bit of this, we need to have a well-defined outcome measure. We need to measure it in an appropriate way and understand how that relates to performance and or injury. And then we need to be able to action that into an intervention when something highlights. And this requires the accumulation and interaction of high quality data. So it's not just one counter movement jump variable. It's not just a decrement in heart rate recovery following a submax or the increase in heart rate during exercise of a submax. It's the interplay with these variables and then other measures potentially of training load that are really integral. And trying to minimize the relative degrees and the quantities of proxy measures, I think is important. It's great that we can do this silent monitoring and step back from it. But if we start stepping back further and further and further, we don't really get a good gauge on what that picture looks like. And so making sure that we have that understanding. And if we can set these processes up, we can lessen the resistance to the decision-making process and improve the likelihood of affecting real change. This is a recent article, and I think it really highlights this idea of decision-making and taking a very pragmatic way to look at these structures, which we might all do within our performance team, but being quite deliberate about it. So this is Schelling and Robertson, and looking at both either the time required to implement change or implement these and the time we're afforded, and both the decision-making processes and how, I guess, subjective to objective, intuitive to analytical they become. And that's important when developing these steps of the process, which you can sort of see here on the right. We gather data, we select the information, we then design and look at analysing that information and gaining insights, and then we make judgments. And those judgments are based on a lot of different things and the time afforded to us, experiences. They might be more analytical judgments, but they're decisions that are getting made at the top end to create intervention. And so there needs to be a very deliberate system of events that can move from identifying that a measurement is important, identifying that a measurement, a piece of data is important and that it's potentially shifted and identifies that this athlete may be at risk, to implementing an intervention. I think importantly, that probably also just to touch on that captures the idea that we're not just collecting data for data's sake, and that we have an end goal with what we're trying to achieve. And often we get technology, we get different bits and pieces, and when we try to utilize them, but they may not fit with the journey that we're going on. So with that in mind, I'll take you through how that might look within an organization. And this is sort of the journey of submaximal fitness testing that I've been on previously over the last few years. For those of you who aren't familiar with submaximal fitness testing, It's a valid and feasible means by measuring autonomic nervous system function, and it may be more appropriate than exposing athletes to maximal testing, albeit it may not be a direct reflection of the same construct, which I'll get to soon. It can help us infer fitness and fatigue relationships along that continuum, and may be important within the systems that you're creating to deliver some of this intervention that we can move an important piece of information. So with all that said, how and why and what do we test? So there are many different ways in which we can utilize submaximal fitness testing. There are many different systems on which you do. Essentially, we're typically trying to get to some sort of a 4 to 6 minute block, typically looking between 80 and 90% of heart rate max delivered at the end of it. What we wanted to achieve is that my gut feel was that we would, when we tested some of our athletes, because we have quite a heterogeneous bunch of athletes from 120 kilo props to 80 kilo hookers and halves and decision makers, is that their physiological and physical capacities are quite divergent. And so doing a standardized test might not be most appropriate in terms of trying to get an end outcome that is quite similar in terms of what constructs we're actually measuring. So we did a individualized maximal fitness test, which was 60% of IFT, 20-second shuttles, which you can sort of see there. Continuous, which is used in literature a bit, 12 kilometers an hour for 4 minutes, and a yo-yo IR1, so modified just the first 4 minutes. All of them stand hand on hips for 2 minutes at the end, measure their heart rate in the last 60 seconds of the work, and then their heart rate profile at 1 minute and 2 minutes at subsequent to the exercise that they were attaining. How it looked on this, so different outcomes there, and obviously potentially different responses for the athletes. When we started to analyze it and look at, again, this idea of reliability, and I'll move to sort of sensitivity, but overall we got a pretty similar response, and within player random variation, once we started to analyze this, we saw that whilst the systematic mean change might be greater for our individualized, when looking on a within individual level, we actually saw trivial changes for those athletes, and that was about half of what we saw with those other tests. Now, that's not to shine light on this and cast those other ones aside. Those other ones are still deemed in literature, very reliable and could certainly be of use. But given our research question, the question we had coming into it, we thought this was an appropriate way to follow. So we introduced this within our pre-season and within our in-season. When we start talking about the interpretation of reliability, earlier I mentioned that test retests, we're looking at a very small window, and for these it was within 3 or 4 days. So when we're trying to interpret that, a small likely change could be deemed important. But given that we have excluded a lot of confounding factors that may influence that heart rate response in that test retest, ground conditions might change as we move into the season, move into the winter months. We highly controlled athlete caffeine base, they're educated across that. Consumption, they're educated across that, but we know that these athletes are potentially going to consume caffeine. That's a limitation of doing this sort of work. So we decided that a moderate likely change was what we would deem as being substantial for these athletes, and that was how we set our noise, so to speak. So we started collecting information. We get a lot of information. We're going through this process of identifying an outcome measure, identifying the measurement tools, identifying what is a sensitive change. And then how do we, visualize that? How does that look? So this is an athlete that was tested across pre-season, and we can apply these thresholds that we identified to look at what is a substantial change and the likelihood that substantial change is real. Again, the change in heart rate during the last 60 seconds or 30 seconds in this example of exercise was quite tight. So identifying that signal can be a bit easier, where the heart rate recovery is far more variable, far more noisy. So across the pre-season, we didn't actually see too much of an influence for this individual. But we can infer from this that they are overall gradually trending down, and so therefore the heart rate response during the same dose of exercise is substantially less, as they're hopefully improving their fitness across this pre-season period. When you take that onto a group mean and looking at the individuals, is that we can start to infer some work from some longitudinal, applying these similar thresholds, looking at the changes. So this is a sort of a report I did for our high performance manager, looking at these changes across the month. So again, we only did it once a month. You potentially look at fortnightly, people do it weekly. So there's certainly more scope there, but identifying who is potentially at risk of being underprepared or has fitness requirements that they need to hit, who is potentially overtraining, overreaching. And this is, again, back to that, what I talked about earlier. It's combined, it's the interaction of this piece of information with other pieces of information that we've attained, that we have developed significance for, to come up with an output, which in that decision-making hierarchy then leads to an intervention. For us, that intervention was generally more rather than less, so it might be more recovery strategies, and that's another, I guess, a discussion for another day about how you can try to optimize those. Or it might be load management and really stripping someone back. We can then also reflect on the greater group over a period of time. So this is looking at a pre-season. So did the individual likely respond to the dose of pre-season based on the construct of changes in heart rate exercise during this submax test, this individualized submax test? And as we can see there, we had overall a likely response from a lot of individuals. Interestingly enough, when we run that same type of analysis for changes in fitness, so this is the 30-15 IFT, we can see that it's a bit more mixed. And what this is telling us, and we've delved a bit deeper into this, but they are identifying different constructs, and some of these changes in fitness and what we've seen recently may have a lot to do with some running efficiency metrics, or pseudo running efficiency metrics that we can start to delve a bit deeper in, but it's likely the output of both a physiological and a mechanical change, and deficiencies or efficiencies in one or the other. And again, we can plot heart rate recovery as well, far more variable, and we didn't garner as much insight in this during this phase. So hopefully that takes you across the journey of our need to be very deliberate in the outcome that we're trying to measure and the way in which we're trying to measure that. Then once we've established our measurement tool, we need to be more pragmatic about the way we set that noise, and not just refer to reliability studies, and not just refer to very controlled test retest scenarios. Utilizing our own data is a great way to sort of incorporate that, and I understand that generally has to need at least a couple of seasons worth of data to establish, which isn't always great, and we want to be actionable from the start. So, you know, there are limitations there, but hopefully once the data source becomes more rich, we can improve those decision-making frameworks. And then onto that topic, to be very deliberate about those decisions that we're making, be they backed by data, numerous sources of data, plus intuition and coach feel as well. But creating an actionable strategy that we can go to an athlete with and enforce is obviously highly important to create change. So I hope that was of use for you. Feel free to get in contact. I don't have my email on there, Sal, but I'm more than happy to have a chat with anyone in and around that. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Tannath. Really appreciate the insight there, and the amount of work that you've obviously put in, not only throughout your PhD, but ongoing in this area around fatigue monitoring and training load response. And it's a really interesting, I guess, discussion point at the moment in particular, because as you mentioned, in AFL and NRL here in Australia, a lot of teams are coming off a shortened pre-season and going into condensed training periods or condensed competition periods. So being able to quantify how athletes are responding to load is a discussion that's happening every day in high performance sport at the moment. And so the couple of the questions I had just in regards to the strategies that we use when we're trying to monitor fatigue, you highlighted using the CMJ and possibly testing match day +2 or +3 and then possibly pre-game. Do you think when we're testing something like that, documenting whether it's a match day +2 or match day +3 and understanding what sort of variation is in that residual fatigue versus possibly persistent fatigue and how we go about documenting that for our practitioners?
Yeah, I think that context is really important. I think we can often just test and lose context. I mean, the documentation side of it, I think, has become more and more important. Well, it's always been important, but I've certainly been victim of before, coming out with an output, and then it might be different to what you've typically done. As you said, you might not have time. Meetings might run long, whatever it might be on that first training day. So you've managed to get them on the second training day, back-to-back training days, and so it's a different context that you're looking at, and you always go, right, I'll make the mental note that that's the case. And then a year later, you start looking at some data and you go, Jesus, that was a bizarre, that was really different there. And if you haven't documented it, then it is tough to remember that. So I think having that context is important. Having continuity in, I'll probably speak to the researcher and the practitioner side here, but I think from research and to make really systematic approaches to interventions, having continuity on the training day is important. And it's important that, for CMJ, we might do it on the day after a day off or limited training, and that is pretty consistent. But at the end of the day, it's a tool to identify, hopefully create action. So if you can't do it on that first training day, and then it comes to the second training day that week, I wouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, which I sort of said there, and go, oh, let's not do it because our variance is going to be different. If you're able to capture data, relay that data to other members of the performance team, and then create a strategy for that individual that might have been different to what you had planned, and that minimise potentially injury risk during the week, then that's a win. And we can't always see the outcomes of those decisions, but hopefully, we develop experience and can assess whether it was successful or not successful. So I think it is important to document. It's important to try to keep some continuity so we're not just all over the shop, but that's not the reality of team sport. So, you work in the constructs that you're given.
And with your sub-max testing that you highlighted at the end there, were you integrating that into the warm-up so it was just part of training rather than it being, we talk about trying to make our testing just part of training, so it's not prepping athletes for a testing day and them thinking that it's always got to be about testing and rather than training?
Yeah. So in that example, we had a pretty good group at Brisbane when we sort of started developing this. The method in which we did it, and I sort of said it was very systematic in the way we approached it, and so we could integrate change with the athletes. So they bought into it probably better than what I was expecting. But part of that was, it was just at the end of the warm-up. So, warm-up might go for 12 minutes or so. We did it for, you did your general movement, dynamic stuff, some run-throughs. I don't think we need to get too complicated. And then into that sort of movement base. So I prepped them for the session, but then included that at the end. So, it was very much funneled into the session.
And part of that report that you had, there were obviously one or two athletes highlighted that fitness is possibly required. Are you then using part of that testing strategy to then add extra training doses at the end by using shuttles based off the 30-15 or other conditioning strategies?
Yeah. So that would be one of the interventions that would be certainly used there. Again, with some of the limitations are an increase in heart rate during the exercise might not necessarily be deduced to fitness or fatigue. So it's about integrating more data as part of that. And part of that is your gut feel on it. In those two cases, it was pretty pronounced. You could have guessed without me showing you the data that yes, that person needed more fitness, and that one was fatigued. But yeah, those fitness strategies would incorporate 30-15 based work, other conditioning based work that was we deemed as specific, and utilizing other GPS metrics as well to figure out how we wanted their profile to look from a external dose, and then what we expected the internal response to be to that. So there's a bit in it. It's not overly complicated, but yeah, it was a deliberate strategy around it.
And in your time, did you find any other correlations with some of your wellness markers or your diary markers at all, or were you doing any CMJ testing at all to see if there was any correlation?
Yeah, we actually did in the wellness. So we've got a paper in review at the moment, looking at modelling 3 years worth of data from an external load perspective and different systems of how we calculate that external load. But then looking at a group level, our objective wellness markers, so our musculoskeletal screening, groin squeeze, Nita Wars, Thomas test, and one other one that'll lose me. And what we found, interestingly enough, and this probably comes back to my point there about the individual, is that on a group level, there are certainly indicators that related to substantial changes or poor decrements in many of those cases, so poor outcomes. But once you apply those models on an individual level, it gets very, very hazy to identify what load parameters and I guess what are the moderating factors of changes in musculoskeletal screening. So that was an interesting one, and that probably, going forward, trying to delve into this idea of getting enough information on the individual to make individual decisions. And the easy answer is coach intuition, but we know coach intuition isn't always right, and your experiences create biases that might not have a favourable outcome for every circumstance. So having data that greater supports those decisions. CMG stuff, like we started playing around with them last year at Brizzy, and it was more trying to get an idea of what we're looking for, what measures are sensitive. We didn't attach a hell of a lot of effort to it. Our strength coach used it to probably more profile rather than fatigue monitor in that year. It was primarily the submax stuff, and then some of our musculoskeletal stuff as well.
Yeah. And obviously, having experience in NRL, you have athletes that are going into Origin and playing multiple games in a week, where they're probably returning to playing while they're still in that possibly residual or persistent fatigue state. I know that you guys did some research with Vince Kelly looking at different recovery strategies. Did you find that there was anything within those that really helped to mediate some of that accumulated fatigue in players that are playing multiple games across a week?
Yeah, so it's been a big question in terms of, one, how do you identify peripheral and central fatigue? Can you? And then can you introduce recovery modalities that may specifically attack one of those mechanisms that you're identifying, and hopefully create a favourable outcome or shift that curve forward a bit so you can try to improve that process. We did some work looking at external counterpulsation devices, which are very expensive. So there's a limitation, full stop. But we had some pretty favourable outcomes on that, and particularly some perceptual responses, but also some acute power responses. So we utilise those quite a bit within our recovery strategies. I think when we look at recovery, there's non-negotiables that we need to attack. And for us, similar to you training in Brisbane, heat and its effect on neurophysiology is massive. And so for us, ice, bars were as much as damping that neural drive, trying to limit contusions as it was anything else we're getting on top of that, or potential decrements that we might see from that. But once you tick off those non-negotiables, the way I sort of foresee recovery is very much perceptual. And if the athlete is getting a perceived benefit, I think that has as much to drive. You talk about those perception of efforts moving forward and how that mediates, central drive and our ability to perform. I think that is a big part of it. The external conversation were very good on that front, and so particularly our submax, we used a lot of that. Rest, every athlete is different, and I understand some athletes, particularly young athletes, may need a dose of load and to understand what load feels like under fatigue. But understanding that athletes can rest, athletes don't need to be doing everything. We can manipulate different stimulus if we need to, and we can manage load. Particularly for guys going to Origin, they're generally better players who probably are more in tune with what they need. So making sure that they're a part of that decision-making process as well. And they've got to earn the right to be a part of that process, but I think that's a big part of it as well.
Yeah, it probably leads me on to my next question around managing athletes, because we're in the current festival of football in the AFL at the moment, yep. And you are seeing in AFL, none of our athletes have ever been exposed to this sort of frequency of game, and even though the intensity may be slightly less because game duration is less, we're accumulating significantly more volume of work across a 7-day window. What's your thoughts on managing athletes to accustom them to greater loads, or like you said, is it based on, well, your better athletes are just able to be more in tune with their body and be able to guide you in that decision-making process? Yeah.
I mean, it's certainly a mix, and the beauty of what you're involved in now is that you've got 40 athletes that you're trying to figure it all out for, which I don't envy that situation at all. But I guess for mine, part of it is understanding, I talked about trying not to get too many proxy measures, but if we talk about load being a pseudo measure for what's going on, that external dose, is that there's going to be different elements of fatigue or adaptation that respond to that. And they're mediated by individual characteristics, which you may or may not know on your athletes. But understanding, I guess, you talk about that high and low frequency fatigue and high and low frequency dose, and the fact that volume may or may not play a part for a lot of guys, but doing a hell of a lot of that game style repeated effort, sprint distance, exposure to that load, and they may not be able to tolerate that side of it. So I think it's understanding your individuals. You're probably going to have to bucket individuals, because you're not necessarily putting 40 different people into the different spots, but bucket guys, understanding what they are potentially tolerable to, what they might need to receive less of during that training and that intervention strategy. And then, it ultimately comes down to having a coach that's willing to understand that and be a part of that process. Because if your coach doesn't really care, then, you're pushing crap uphill from the get-go. But I think that density and distribution of load in the current climate you're in, and that people and practitioners are in, is really important.
Yeah, no, I agree. And you brought up an interesting topic around the fatigue and whether it increases injury risk in relation to ACLs and possibly knee injuries. And I wonder, we have seen a couple more ankle syndesmosis injuries within AFL, and whether or not there has been a degree of accumulative fatigue, where you talk about that persistent fatigue. Are there athletes who actually aren't returning to their normal or their bandwidth prior to a game, so that as we get through the game, they have slightly less proprioceptive ability or neuromuscular control? What do you see as being kind of the future moving there in regards to being able to quantify and measure those responses?
Yeah, there's a lot of work that needs to be done in this space, and that's probably the more I've experienced it, the more I've been involved in it, and speaking to the likes of yourself, great practitioners and others, and then the research side of it. It's very anecdotal at the moment, and the setup of research probably doesn't lend itself. That low frequency fatigue, that persistent fatigue, I think that has my gut feel is that it's very related to some of those injuries, and that idea of muscle coordination and how that proprioceptive ability, whether it be across multi-joints or a singular joint, but that ability to coordinate movement when under that low level fatigue. Some researchers in Belgium, I forget them, but they've done some research looking at coordination patterns and following a cohort of football players, might have been the Bundesliga, I could have that completely wrong, but for like 12 to 18 months, and looking at increasing injury risk with those who had previous injury, which shows deficits in coordination patterns. So I think, we're talking healthy pop here, but obviously when you're talking rehab, that coordination pattern and restoring those systems and reducing that deficit is highly important, but potentially having a bit of that approach to general training and healthy pop, I think is particularly important, particularly those guys who may be at risk from previous injury or may not have the tolerance due to training age.
Yeah, I think there's definitely an interesting space there with the use of IMUs and even some of the foot insole research that's currently going on. I know Matt Jordan's been putting some content out around that. So whether or not there is something that you talk about, the invisible monitoring with some of the GPS metrics, whether or not that becomes a future advancement in that area as well. I certainly think we can. There's a lot of those IMU companies that are popping up, and I certainly think that there's some space there to identify locomotor efficiency and inefficiency and some of that stuff. We did some of that stuff a few years ago at the Bronx. It's a particularly noisy world when you're trying to figure it all out. But I definitely think there's something to identifying, and we've seen it with even submax stuff and looking at neuromuscular function. I think it's Joel Garrett's done some stuff at Port, looking at some strides and how we can, the relationship between them and jumping, and trying to make it, I guess, a bit more of an ecologically valid assessment of neuromuscular function. There's certainly some work to be done in that space for sure. Yeah, definitely. And I guess to finish off with you and where you're at the moment, what's the future hold research-wise, and what you're planning for your future work?
Yeah, so COVID's put a bit of a hit to the postdoc that started last September. So at the moment, I'm finishing up a few different research projects that I've sort of had on. I'm trying to come up with a few research projects in this space with a couple of practitioners across the world, trying to answer some of these questions that I've sort of delved a bit into today. The postdoc is moving completely out of my wheelhouse, and it's more going to be looking at, or hopefully looking at, some spatial temporal work, which is been interesting to read up on behavioural sciences and how systems move and stuff like that. So anyway, it's all learning, which I'm enjoying. So things are going well with me. Obviously, it's been like everyone, it's been a bit of a acclimation phase to figure out what we're doing. But it's been good to sit back and watch some footy recently, to be honest.
Yeah, no, well, fantastic insight from you around some of the work you've done and the future work that no doubt will be having an impact in high performance sports. So really appreciate your time today, and thanks, and all the best for what the future holds.
Awesome. Cheers, Sal. Appreciate it, mate.